Good evening, good evening. Welcome back to the book club with your host garethcmckay. I am GC. How's it all going? Right, well, I'll settle in. Been a couple of weeks, so it's probably going to be slightly shaky, I suppose. I don't know. See how it all goes. Well, I suppose it's a little bit tricky to introduce this one because if it wasn't obvious, I'm quite a big fan of Michel Houellebecq. These are just a few copies of the books I've got. I've also read Atomized, or the Elementary Particles, The Possibility of an Island, Lanzarote, and I think that is actually everything, including these, and now Annihilation. I suppose I'm going to introduce what the book is all about first before I start talking about it, in terms of what I liked, in terms of what I didn't, what the story is, all of that jazz. I'm going to guess that quite a few of you didn't finish it. That's my first estimation, or not in a DNF sense, but I kind of feel like you're struggling, but we'll get into that. It's very quiet in here at the moment, so I'll just keep rambling on. So yeah, the book Synopsis is 2027. France is in a state of economic decline and moral decay. As the country plunges into a closely fought presidential campaign, the French state falls victim to a series of mysterious and unsettling cyber attacks. The sophisticated nature of the attacks leaves the best computer scientists at the DGSI, the French counter-terrorism agency, scrambling for answers. This is an interesting synopsis, for one thing. I'll comment on that in a minute. An advisor to the country's financial minister, Paul Rasson, or raison d'etre, is close to the heart of the government. His wife Prudence is a Treasury office official, while his father Edouard, now retired, has spent his career working for the DGSI. When Edouard has a stroke, his children have an opportunity to repair their strained relationships as they determine to free their father from the medical centre where he is wasting away. It's not incorrect what that said. I feel like it does somewhat capture what the book is about and gives a... Okay, so with the first stanza, the reason I take umbrage with it is mainly because the cyber attacks and terrorism threats and whatnot are merely a subplot in the book. Sorry to spoil it, but this is the book club, so but yeah, it doesn't really serve as anything else aside from that. It's barely even a subplot, I would say. It kind of parallels what's happening within this family situation, and it does lend itself quite nicely to what's going on, and it is often a welcome break from what you're reading. I found I actually felt a little bit cheated, because at the beginning it mentions quite a few of these things, and there's one of the characters, I believe it's Bruno, who ends up running for president. There's a video of him that releases online of him being decapitated, I think by a guillotine, and the CGI in it is so good that they can't even work out how the hell they've put it together and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. He's taken a different turn with this completely, only to then find out more and more about this family rather than the cyber attacks. And once it comes back, you're kind of like, okay, where is this going? And there is a lot of where is this going for the first 250 odd pages. And when it comes to the second stance, I'll get to that. Yeah, the second paragraph in the synopsis there. Yeah, that's true. Paul Rasson is our main character, I would say, but there's so many other characters in it that I wouldn't. I mean, and it's only really because of the ending that he takes the pedestal, I would say. Him and Prudence to a certain extent, whereas the other characters kind of have to take a back pedal. And I thought that was a slight shame, mainly, although the payoff is good, like it pays off really nicely, and the last 200 pages, or certainly 150, are as poignant as the ending of Atomized is. It's heartbreaking to read, but it's also oddly comforting, and I think Houellebecq has a great skill in that regard. And I will have a couple of questions, or at least I do have some theories behind whether or not the lead up to that actually we were paid off because we'd followed these characters, or was it simply just because it was good writing and we didn't actually necessarily need the build up to it? I'm curious about that, because this novel's too long. that's the first thing I'll probably say. It is way too long. I kind of feel like maybe Houellebecq has got to a stage in his career and has such respect, and maybe due to the complications with this getting published or but then again, it's only the translation that was the problem. I'm flummoxed actually as to why it is as long as it is, because it's unnecessary, and that it feels like almost as if the boring parts in it are there to kind of show or be exemplary of the kind of listlessness of life itself, because even in general, like a lot of conflict or even moments where you feel like there's going to be a bit of a potentially like similar to in Serotonin, when it comes to the agricultural element to it and how the farmers start protesting, and it does get quite exciting. This kind of teases all of that, but any moment of conflict is quickly ameliorated by the sheer fact that it's almost like, well, that's just what happens in life. And I kind of wondered whether it was kind of toying with that because of the political element of the piece, where things are hyped over, things are investigated, conspiracies are made, but then the next thing just comes along and we kind of forget about it. So, and that's kind of what it felt like to me quite a bit at the time. And sometimes I didn't mind it. I did enjoy reading this novel, but I will also say that it's kind of like the best of Houellebecq and the worst of Houellebecq, to quote Dickens. Like it really felt odd to me that it was such a mixture of his strongest and, I would say, worst elements. Because talk about run-on sentences and even bad translation at times. There wasn't many moments of it, but there were definitely a few where I was like, that just reads incorrectly. Either that's a typo or or the translator's not particularly great in English. I don't know. It was kind of odd. I was just like trying to read a few sentences and thinking that doesn't work in that regard. So yeah, for the first 200 odd pages, I'll admit I was bored. And there wasn't much keeping me reading it aside from the fact that I was having to talk about the book tonight. I did think maybe at some point I will start to, enjoy reading about these characters. And there was a moment when I did. I was quite intrigued by the trajectory it was taken. So to get to my point about the synopsis, the reason I feel it's a bit misleading is mainly because, there is an incident with his father. He has a stroke. He's a vegetable, basically. So then discussions about what they can do with his estate, the money situation. Does it go to his new wife, Madeline, who's there? Should they divide it amongst the siblings instead? Who's going to take ownership of all of this kind of stuff? And it's interesting. It's almost like it reminded me of kind of Succession, but without the brutal humour. Although it had it in a couple of moments here and there. And Death of a Salesman, it had that kind of vibe where it felt like it was kind of hinting at like either the destruction of a family unit, even though they're not that close anyway, or potentially like, the harsh truths were all going to come out because it's all to do with death, basically. But what I found mostly was that it was a bit muddled in what it was trying to be, and why I think the editor was wrong not to say you need to pick a lane here, basically, because it's all very well having this political stuff in it, but then you've got Secret Service, then you've got cyber attacks, then you've got dream sequences of all fucking things. I have no idea why those are still in there. Literally I didn't even... It was ironic because sometimes a chapter would run on and I'd find myself drifting off, only to get to the next chapter and realise I was in a dream sequence. And I was just like, that's ironic, because I was basically falling asleep because of like what it was going on. And it's weird because it sounds like I'm trashing it. It's not actually a bad thing that it's boring in some ways. There is a comfort to reading it. And I do think a lot of it is kind of the point. But, we're reading a novel here, not a kind of whimsical and almost irreverent piece of, non-linear paragraphs. And that is a little bit harsh, I would say. I don't know. It was softer. Like, I kind of felt like he's getting a bit soft in his old age, and you could say that in regard to the ending, but I did find a lot of similarities with, especially Atomized, but I was more invested in Atomized because I did feel something for the characters, despite them being bigger pieces of shit, if you want to use that kind of phrase, than the characters in this are kind of bland, I would say, overall. I mean, you've got one super bitch, but she's really like a subcategorical side character. She's not part of the family. She's just one of the wives of the brothers, and the brother who no one really cares about. So and to try and summarize it all in one go is difficult. You'll never get it in a synopsis, because whilst it mentioned things about these cyber attacks and whatnot, I think that takes up about 50 pages in what I've got the same copy of about 520 odd pages, which isn't really enough to warrant it being in the synopsis, in my view. And I did think it was a slight shame on that, because I was really wondering if he was actually going to bring that in, and there was going to be some sort of catastrophic and possibly apocalyptic event. But it became quite clear that whilst it hinted at that, it was more a foreshadowing of, like, first the family unit is going to be dented, then it's going to be discussing things about medical care, euthanasia to a certain extent, of which Houellebecq is against. And then with the kind of terrorism that's going on, it's actually going to be more of a capitulation of the individual. So that's where Paul Rasson comes into it. And once he gets mouth cancer, it's pretty much game over from there on. But that I have to admit, I did think that part was like, it was so clinically described to the point where we're actually reading about how much, the tumour will stink because of Well, I mean, basically because it's a cancer cell that's essentially breathing out of his mouth, and it smells worse than shit, as the book described. And I don't know, there were parts that I felt it was still very Houellebecqian, but almost not. And I feel like if I was to try and, it's like almost like he was trying to escape himself in quite a lot. And if you've read some of his stuff, you know what to expect. There's going to be hookers, there's going to be weird sexual practices, there's going to be some pretty out there types of humor, discussions in general. I mean, you've got whatever, where a character is basically like basically an incel of today who wants his ugly colleague to try and kill someone and all this, and he's trying to convince him to do it. And it's just like, it's a lot. I actually found more similarities with that novel and this one than I probably did any other. But the difference with La Domaine is that it's far shorter, and any parts where it's a little bit filler-esque are limited because of that. And in this one, they're elongated for reasons that I can't fully explain. I mean, there's moments in it where there's an inadvertent blowjob given, which I thought was going to lead to some pretty hilarious consequence later on, but it was kind of irrelevant in the end, and that kind of makes me wonder, why was it in it then? Was it just him reminding us that it's a Houellebecq book? I don't know. But in the same vein, I still felt like Houellebecq was clearly in it, because the sex stuff was still there. It was just saved for the end, and it was under an umbrella of love and affection rather than pain and anguish and suffering. And whilst it wasn't the characters explicitly saying it, it was Houellebecq as a narrator still kind of coming out. And there were a few, like, you know, women are just like this is women are better than this, and you know, there's a kind of balanced thing, but there's a lot of judgment. And in fairness, he does do this with guys as well, makes kind of generalizations, or he makes a comment about generalizations being a very male thing, but most of the time it's to do with women. And it's not like it's leaning one way or the other. It's kind of, you know, just an observation. But even within this kind of like attempt at writing a different type of novel, I could still see threads of Houellebecq coming through. So that kind of makes me wonder, why wasn't it just chopped down a bit more? And yeah, a bit more controlled, I would say. Like his... And I just wonder whether it's got something to do with his status and the editors just kind of going with it because they know it's going to sell, especially if he says it's going to be his last book and all this kind of stuff. And there's even in the swan song kind of sense, the last couple of 100 pages is kind of like an ode to literature itself anyway, which worked, I thought, quite well considering the situation that Paul finds himself in. But it was a little bit like, is this just Houellebecq talking at this moment? And that's fine. I mean, it's almost like he was paying homage to all of the writers he was inspired by, or who he admired, and their stylings and what their works actually implemented or what they provoked and all this kind of stuff. And the stuff about history and things like that were intriguing, but it just felt a little bit, it's just lacking in conflict overall. And I don't know whether that is acceptable in all honesty. I mean, I like the novel, I still enjoyed it, and I did get quite invested in it, and the last part of it. And the point I wanted to bring up earlier was that the last couple of 100 pages, you could feel that you're compensating for it a little bit because you've been waiting for something significant, in a sense, to happen. But I kind of wonder, like, if you didn't read everything that led up to it, would it have really changed anything? And I don't think it would. Because if say, when Cecile, who is his sister, and she's like a Catholic, quite, you know, a good girl, let's say, there's a scene when she rushes into the hospital and has a massive go at him because he's decided not to get surgery and instead go for chemotherapy. But the surgery would have been potentially more likely to keep him alive. He just would have been quite severely disabled. And so, judging his quality of life, he decides to go with chemo instead. If that was like a novella from that point onwards, I wonder how much you would have really missed out on. Because I still think it would have been as delicate and poignant as it was without everything that led up to it. And I think if that is the case, then it should have been edited overall. He comes to conclusions about love and being the kind of only thing that matters in the end. Although, in true Houellebecqian style, that included 3-hour blowjobs and hot pants and G-strings and whatnot, which I kind of thought was hilarious, but at the same time, it's like, so you're talking about, you know, love and affection and all this, and then it's like, great arse, you know, make sure that arse is shown off, kind of thing. So it was still it's like Houellebecq's trying to escape himself, but at the same time it still comes out all at the end. And I just found that kind of ironic, I suppose. Anyway, let me get. I'm not actually sure whether it's his last book, but that's what he said. Apparently, I would think it would be a shame for this to be his last, because it feels a little bit more, actually, funnily enough, more indulgent than the others. And I think the main problem is that it does lack conflict. I mean, you've got conflicts in it in the literal sense, but the effect between the characters is very often brought up and you think it's going to go some way. So, like, for instance, the dad is basically a vegetable. He's in a awakened but non-responsive state, as they call it now. And so he's in his care home, and then there's this whole operation, quite literally, to get him out because of the legislature, and like there's complications within, you know, his government and like the reasons for him being there. He's not really supposed to leave, but he can leave, but he needs to be able to say so, and he can't do that because he can only really blink and all this kind of stuff. So they plan to break him out, and you think, okay, this is going to lead to something consequential, and it does, but at the same time it kind of gets dropped. Like, once it's done, it gets done pretty quickly, everything seems fine. Then there is a kind of consequence, but that's to do with the youngest brother, Aurelian, his is the most savage, but I almost found his story the most intriguing in a lot of ways. And when he commits suicide because of what he deems to be his fault, basically, so once the dad gets out, they make it so that no one can ever really find out about it unless they fucking talk. He's getting divorced to his wife, and in an argument it turns out this happens like off book, but later on he confesses that he tells his wife. We all know that his wife's a bitch because it's been noted quite a few times already. She writes, she's a journalist, or wannabe one, and she writes a whole article about this because it's going to cause a bit of an uproar for Bruno, who is the guy running for presidency, and she's trying to basically stick a thorn in its plan. And Aurelian feels very guilty about this because he was the one who, you know, spilled the beans, but he was also having an affair with a black immigrant who worked there. And it seemed like they were actually going to try and have a life together once he gets a divorce. But when this article comes out, in a moment of, I would say, hysteria or possibly delirium, he hangs himself, which I thought the timing of that bit was actually really good. I was like, fuck, I didn't expect that. And even though in some ways it seemed obvious, like his life is determined towards suicide, basically. But when it happens, and the more you think about it, the more you think, man, he really didn't need to do that, kind of thing. It was a bit like you kind of can't see the sense in it. But then almost the novel leaves it behind, I found. Like, as I thought, fuck, what consequences is this going to have? And that's kind of where that whole arc ends. And then before you know it, the kind of lead character, if you will, is diagnosed with a terminal illness, and that kind of takes the stage for the remainder of the novel. And that was I mean, there's one bit where as I said, you've got to have the hooker moment. He decides to see a hooker because it seems him and his wife are going to get intimate again, and it's been like 10 years or something. They've been together still in a marriage sense, but only on paper. They live together but in separate rooms. They barely talk, but this is kind of bringing them closer and closer. And because it's been a while for him, he thinks he needs the services of a hooker, so he hires one, goes to meet her. It's a bit dark. She starts sucking him off, and then he wants to see her, so she brings a light, and then he realizes it's his niece. Which was funny, and but kind of unnecessary. I mean, I didn't actually see any reason for Annihilation to be in the book overall, because it's like that was literally her whole purpose. And it happens, and it's obviously awkward, and there's what the fuck, and then it's but then again, I mean, I think it gets mentioned once later on, and I don't know, I kind of feel like what he succeeded in was kind of giving us tidbits of life. Actually, it just felt like you were reading about real people's lives without getting too into detail about it all, and you saw how ephemeral, how meaningless a lot of it is, and that is alluded to in the prose quite often, about how basic a lot of our lives are. And I think that's what lent it to kind of like this oddly comforting type of read. I mean, it talks about nihilism, it talks about Nietzsche, it talks about Pascal, it talks about Arthur Conan Doyle at the end, and then it almost feels like it's really well constructed, and it's got, the depth that it goes into is impressive, and it all kind of amounts to fuck all. So I mean, I almost admire the ambition of it, and I also admire how he's clearly got this vision of, like, France, the family, everything that's been going on, sort of right-wing politics, terrorism, all of this stuff. And what does it all amount to? A blowjob. But essentially, that's kind of what it all comes down to in the end. And I mean, the cyber attack stuff, I wanted a bit more of that, and I found it very intriguing, and I thought it was actually well sought out, because it's linked to this satanic or Satanist group, and you even have a Pentagon image, and they use that as coordinates at one point, and you think, fucking hell, this has turned into like an espionage thing for about 10 pages, and then it kind of moves away from there, and you just have a lot of these kind of side characters that are interesting, but ultimately only are there to kind of prop up a couple of our other characters who ultimately get forgotten about, like everyone does, I suppose, in life. And that's the thing. It's almost like he's trying to find, in some ways, almost like an alternate style of telling a story. It might be a bit far-fetched, but or I suppose if you were to compare it to something like the existentialist novels, like Nausea or whatever, it's like the meaning is gone, and it's kind of about structuring that meaning or trying to explain it in a modern sense. And he uses AI kind of stuff, but it feels very sporadic and almost like it's only really there to kind of almost individuate the different sections of the book, and that's about it. I don't really see much consequence for it overall. It's not like I don't think it should have been in there, but yeah. Yeah, it is a lot. It's a lot like that. Well, I mean, that was also hilarious. I mean, the part when you also find out about the guy who kills himself, who is the youngest brother, when he's trying to divorce his wife, he admits to his sister that he isn't actually sterile, and this is quite a shock to her because he has a son with his current wife, but the wife decided to go and get artificial insemination from a black donor instead of actually having children with the guy she marries, which I have to admit, I think that puts her at top level cunt. Like, I can't really think of it. I don't know what kind of cuck would agree to this. I mean, in any regard, like how henpecked and pussy whipped do you need to be? But then you also start to question what's her motivation for marrying him, and it was literally something to do with these these sculptures that the mother made, because she seems to think that they're going to be worth an almighty fucking fortune at some point, and is kind of hedging all of her bets on that. And she's like this typical liberal type who is pretty dumb, and is all virtue signaling and all that. And there's even a kind of a hint that probably the only reason she actually picked a black donor for having this baby was because it gave her brownie points, I suppose in the quite literal term, in the eyes of progressives and whatnot, which I thought was delicious. Like I was like, oh, this is the kind of stuff I would love it if the whole novel was just about this, in a way, because with her and the guy she's married and his decision to kill himself, and when he ironically has an affair with a black immigrant, and the stuff that comes out of that is actually quite fascinating. I thought it was a slight shame it couldn't hone in, whereas with Paul and Prudence's relationship, it's beautiful. I mean, I think there is like it's almost like what he alludes to in Serotonin when the main character talks about his parents and how they were like just a unit throughout their whole life, and in the Western world that has capitulated almost completely. And this is almost like his account of that kind of thing, and it works very well. There's a nice little kind of link to the Beatles, and their relationship is touching, to say the least. I mean, it didn't hit me as hard as Atomized, because in that it's like every character just fucking it's like a domino effect in that book, where it's just like everyone just starts dying off, and he deals with that in such a delicate manner. And in this one it makes it more individuated, I suppose, or at least to one couple and one man in particular. And there was a kind of irony because of the fact that he's dying and he knows he's going to be dead soon. That kind of frees him to be able to perform sexually whenever he wants, to just live with his wife in total harmony and things like that. And yeah, it is genuinely moving, and it finishes it off in a way you'd want it to. But the more I've reflected on it, the more I do still wonder if it was just 200 pages of that, I'm not sure I would have been unsatisfied with not having had the characters that were surrounding them from before. Because the dad is like it's interesting to learn a bit about the Secret Service and all of that, but he's basically like a non-entity in it. He's used as a conduit for the narrative to get at play. Madeline is just a younger woman who's married him after the wife died. She's very devoted. That's quite sweet, you know. She basically wants to be a carer for him completely. But again, I mean, Cecile is kind of the same. Bruno's kind of quite interesting. But again, I kind of feel like they're almost... If I was to be brutal, it almost feels like, okay, I need these characters. Okay, that's the name. What do they do? And it's almost got like the tick box kind of element of like, okay, so they're a financial advisor or they're a lawyer. Tick that off. What do they like doing? Okay, one of them's a vegan. We just pick, and it almost felt like it just needs to tick a few boxes, and then that's the character. When I actually found that the ones who showed a bit of fucking personality, like Indy, and even Aurelian to a certain extent, at least when he started having an affair, were far more intriguing. And his suicide was far more intriguing because it was just like, wow, he really showed what a pussy he is. But at the same time, it's like you kind of want to know what was it that made him like that. And with his black son, or his basically his wife's son, he's like a typical Gen Z, obsessed with just looking at his phone, and he's just completely disinterested in being around this family. And there was the dynamic there was actually quite fascinating. And you know, Paul and Prudence don't have kids, so that doesn't come into it at all. And in fact, they don't really have anything else apart from each other. And as beautiful as that is, toward the end, they only really come together because that's when the plot needs them to, and it does so through death, essentially. Because even though it is very sad, because they seem to be in a rapprochement, and then as his life is wont to do, that was when boom, sorry dude, you got mouth cancer, motherfucker. You're either gonna cut out that jaw and remove your tongue so you can live like your old man for the next couple of 5 months, or you can try your luck with chemo and then you'll probably be dead in 3 or whatever. I did think the research behind everything was like, I mean, I think Houellebecq was actually into or he worked in coding and things like that, you know, long time back. And you can kind of tell with the amount of detail he will go into what actually happens when somebody is diagnosed with such a thing, or when they go to the dentist. There was all of these kind of discussions about the different procedures, and then he has to go and see a different type of doctor, an EMT, and all. It was like heavy on the like medical kind of aspects and what it is. And whilst I appreciated that, it didn't really lend itself that well to the prose overall. There were moments, and I will actually read what I thought was one of the best bits. Yeah, that's a good point there, Jay. Yeah, I was going to mention Herve, or Hervé. I'm not quite sure on the pronunciations. Well, I mean, that's kind of what the novel, and especially Hot Pants and 3 Hour Blowjobs, which I have to admit, I think most guys would agree with this. I mean, if you are in your last days, I can't really think of a better way of going out, having a loving woman by your side who, yeah, still desires you sexually, even though you smell literally like a corpse. So, yeah, that was touching. Yeah, I mean, I actually wanted a bit more of him as well. I was just going to say this. But now that I think about it, I'm kind of like struggling to think of what it was that I... Oh yeah, when he was having a go about Indy, and the fucking hatred that was there, that was great. Not enough of it. I actually felt like in a lot of ways he probably should have combined a few characters, and perhaps then we could have gone into their lives a bit more. I don't know, who am I? It's the height of hubris, isn't it, really, to criticise how it's put together. I still thought the characters were well realised. It just felt a little bit like, why introduce us so much to them if in the end they don't, or they aren't that relevant? I suppose there were kind of allusions to like human relationships, especially ones with close relations or supposed close relations, and how a lot of the time we don't really know one another. And I think that was actually a very, on the money, and it's kind of like realist fiction, even with all of the kind of like, I don't know. Well, actually, I don't even think the terrorist attacks that were happening in it weren't particularly extravagant. I didn't think there was the stuff about this Wiccan religion had some interesting elements, but largely felt pretty trivial. Although I suppose it did somewhat connect with other themes that were going on within it, especially when it came to like faith in general and what people's outlook on life was when it comes to the end and all this kind of stuff. Speaking of which, I mean, this kind of goes with it, but yeah, where it kind of stuck out for me prose wise, I think it's around just a couple of pages. Just see where it is. 464. Yeah, this stuck out to me because it was actually where he took a kind of position on it, and it's based. Trying to remember where. He had heard this idea several times in his life before rejecting it as absurd. Various magazine articles in his youth had popularized the ideas of American sociobiologists about the selfish gene. American sociobiologists saw procreation as a kind of primitive scream from the gene, ready for anything to ensure its own survival, even to the detriment of the most elementary interests of the host individuals, via an audacious deception that by reproducing they would win the game against death, while of course the opposite was true. In all animals, reproduction was a crucial step toward death, when it did not actually cause it, and that partial genetic survival would in any case have been nothing but a derisory parody of authentic survival. Nothing in the memory that he had of his father corresponded to that pattern. Having devoted his life to French military success, his father saw himself everywhere. He knew, as one of the guardians of the order and security of his country, and perhaps of the Western world more generally, disappointed by Paul's attitude towards the DGSI. He had been even more disappointed by Aurelian's, seeing it as a rejection of the principles that had governed his life, so the bulk of his affection had been transferred to Cecile, and later to her husband. There was nothing genetic in any of it. This was cultural transmission in the purest state. This stupidly reductionist conception of the part of the sociobiologist strangely lent support to an already well-established American conception of childhood, to which the contemporary American novel continued to bear witness. In it, professional, friendly, and romantic relationships were depicted with the most repellent cynicism, while relationships with children appeared as a kind of enchanted space, a magical little island in an ocean of selfishness that might have been entirely understandable in the context of the baby who could send you in a few seconds from paradise with its flesh huddled against your shoulder to the hell of unmotivated cries of rage, in which it already manifests its tyrannical and domineering nature. The 8-year-old child, sanctified as a partner in a game of baseball and as mischievous little chap, still has his charm, but things go sour very quickly, as everyone knows. Parents' love of their children is well attested. It's a kind of natural phenomenon, particularly in women, but children never respond to that love and are never worthy of it. Children's love of their parents is absolutely against nature. If by some misfortune they had had a child, Paul reflected there would have never been a chance of getting back together with Prudence. As soon as the child reaches the shores of adolescence, the first task assumed by the child is to destroy the couple formed by its parents, and in particular to destroy it in sexual terms. The child cannot under any circumstances bear its parents engaging in sexual activity, particularly with each other. It logically considers that from the moment of its birth, that activity has no longer any reason to continue, and is henceforth only a disgusting old people's vice. This is not exactly what Freud taught, but Freud didn't understand much about it in any case. After destroying its parents as a couple, the child sets about destroying them individually, its chief preoccupation being to wait for their death so that it can inherit its legacy, as clearly established in the French realist literature of the 19th century. One can consider oneself lucky that they do not set about hastening the settlement date, as they do in Maupassant, who didn't invent anything and who knew Norman peasants better than anyone. So that is how things happen, generally speaking, with children. I didn't read it very well, but I thought that was particularly poignant. And sadly, I thought they were a bit few and far between, those moments. Yeah, I think I'm probably with you on that overall. I only finished it today, and I had to have a bit of a marathon session with it over the last couple of days, so I think I might be still in a state of like, okay, what did I actually think of that? It's one of those things. I enjoyed it, and I still felt like Houellebecq was in it, in a sense. Of course, it still felt like a Houellebecq book. I'm probably just going to repeat myself, but yeah, again, it was the best and worst of him, and I did find it very commendable that he was so ambitious with the piece, and it was almost like a hark back to almost classical novels, where the indulgence of it was kind of part of the novel in a lot of ways. It wasn't all about being entertained and grasped and titillated. It was actually almost in defiance of what we have now in modernity. Does that make it interesting? That's debatable, I would say. Is it its goal to be interesting? I don't know. The despair and like musings regarding nihilism and whatnot are very intriguing, but it's hard to. There aren't many passages in it that I would nitpick out and say, well, this is Houellebecq at his finest, or anything like that. But there were moments of it. I just kind of I guess overall I did hope for more, especially given that I've been waiting 2 years to read this fucking thing, and that hasn't helped for sure. I think the translation's fine for the most part, but I can't really say on that front too much. But yeah, there were a few little oddities here and there. And yeah, my biggest complaint would be the dream sequences. Like, if at least he cut those out, you would have probably shaved off about 20 or 30 pages at least, and it would have made no difference. I mean, I think the biggest risk with those kind of things is like if it's not relevant to what's going on, which they kind of were, but only in the typical dream sense. That's kind of what I think people, say why you shouldn't use dream sequences is because if you go for the typical reason for it being there, e.g. someone's dying or there's a catastrophe afoot, obviously you're going to dream about some pretty freaky shit when you're falling off a building or whatever. All your teeth fall out. And whilst he doesn't go to that extent, yeah, there's definitely elements of it there. But if you take something like The Unbearable Lightness of Being, like the dream sequences in that are very relevant to the relationship at the forefront of the novel and are consequential to it, whereas these ones just felt indulgent just for the sake of it. But that was probably well, there's not a lot to remember from them, to be honest. I didn't think. And yeah, I mean, I suppose the questions I ask myself when it comes to these things is, would I read it again over his other novels? Not likely, if I'm honest. I do think maybe at some other point I might go back to it, but I would imagine it would take me probably 20 years, to just, and that would probably be me, similar to how Paul starts reading a lot of Sherlock Holmes and all this kind of stuff. Like if I was revisiting some of my favourite writers, I would imagine the same way sometimes I do it with the director or whatever. I'd go through their catalogue and maybe I'd read it from, the beginning through to the end, but I wouldn't exactly be looking forward to getting to this one, if that's, and to me, I mean, I don't know where I put it, but because I enjoyed the map and the territory, the possibility of an island, atomized serotonin, whatever. With whatever I probably would couple with this book, whereas the others, they're more fun, for sure. And I kind of want more of the arseholes. I want more of Houellebecq, I did think Platform was dull, to be honest, and I've still actually yet to finish that. And I felt Submission was similar, actually. And I suppose politically speaking it had more in common with this book than others, but at least that one took a kind of what would you call it, a hypothetical scenario, and went with it, and was quite scathing in its cultural analysis, let's say. Really, you put Platform third? That's interesting. I'll have to revisit that one, because I don't know what it was. I think I got to I haven't actually finished it, but the other two I'd probably agree, Atomized and Serotonin. I really liked the possibility of an island. I thought that was underrated, actually. And Lanzarote I've read. I mean, I don't really consider that a novel. That would probably be pretty low on my estimation. That felt more like biographical kind of memoir in a sense. But yeah, I mean, my favourites are Serotonin and Atomized, and I'd probably, like, depending on whether you want first person or third, I'd put them together. That's a possibility of an island. Yeah, the map and the territory I did also. I enjoyed it, but I think that's just because I enjoy his. There is something about his style. I don't know. I don't think it's to do with his prose. I think it's more to do with his societal thumb on the pulse of society kind of thing. I like the fact that I think whatever, or we just fucking, because the title of whatever sucks. Extension du domaine de la lutte. So that's like extension of the struggle of the fight or something along those lines, which doesn't, it doesn't roll off the tongue. I can't remember exactly what the translation is on that one. Yeah, I have. Yeah, it's all right. It's quite funny in places, but I don't think anything more than that overall. Very French, shall we say. But yeah, I mean, I think that's it for my analysis of it. I can't really lend much else to it. I thought there were obviously a lot of positives, but again, I thought there were a lot of negatives. Too long. My main thing is it's fucking too long. Like, if it was like a debut novel of someone that, for instance, I'd watched on YouTube. Or someone of whom I hadn't read much, like if I'd only read one or two novels by them before, I think a part of me would have been very tempted to give up on this. And yeah, and I would have read it a lot slower, probably, because I almost felt like the novel wanted me to read it slower, because it is quite, well, lacking in pace, shall we say, which is fine. It's not even a criticism. I do think in some ways it was almost refreshing to read something where it was like, just take your time, savor what's happening a little bit more, reflect on it a bit, then come back to the next chapter or whatever. But that element of the novel also lent itself toward what I would accuse it of being indulgent, overly so. And I do think it's his name that got it edited, that got it, well, lack of it. I'd be very curious to know how edited this is. Did he just dump down, a 1,500 page manuscript and they only managed to like cut it down to 500 pages or what? Like, it's confusing, and I don't really understand everything that happens surrounding it either, especially when it comes to the English translation. I'm like, why the fuck did that take so long? That was just weird. Yeah, I don't know, because it's almost like it kind of feels like it's spoiled the fact that it's supposedly his last book, because a lot of other countries have already reviewed it and moved on and forgotten it. So maybe it does all come down to just love in the end. well, there was something I read about that. There was an article by Anne Manoff in Unheard. It's quite a good article, and she talks about that at the beginning, and of how it talked about the Matrix Reloaded being, in her view, the best novel or the best movie of the bunch, which is I think it must be taking the piss, but maybe in some sense because of its almost like lack of caring about whether it's some sort of commercial success, and maybe it's alluding to his own novel and all that kind of stuff. I didn't think it talked about that much, though, to be honest. Maybe a little bit here and there, but then he still related it to the actress who played Trinity, Carrie-Anne Moss, which I mean, she's fine, but it kind of talked about her as if she was some bombshell, which I kind of feel like anyone who thinks that she's like a stunning woman is a latent homosexual, to be honest. I mean, I know that's no criticism to her at all. She is still an attractive woman. She's masculine, is what I'm getting at. So, but I mean, those kind of parts in the novel, fine. I don't have a problem with it. I mean, there was Kurt Cobain got brought up a few times, but almost like totally needlessly. And then the Beatles, then a bit with a few authors here and there. It felt almost like a scrapbook in a lot of ways of all the things he's ever wanted to talk about, which is unfair because it is well structured. I can't fault it for that, and the research that's gone into it is pretty immense, I would say. But the politics stuff was as dull as you expect political discussions to be, especially when you don't have dickheads in it. You needed more dickheads to actually make that entertaining. You should have known that from Succession, for one thing. Yeah, I mean, it's a similar thing that I think happened with Tarantino when he lost his editor. And you can definitely like if you watched Django Unchained, the section that he appears in it in his cameo role, and the other bit where he the actor dances on the fucking horse, like it's so stupid. Like there's no reason for it to be there. And there are chapters guilty of this, I would say, or not the chapters necessarily, but some of the content within are just like, why is that there? As hilarious as it was that his own niece gave him a blowjob for like a minute, why was it there? I mean, come on. And if you are going to make it contemporary, she should have been an OnlyFans model or something like that. Like I was a bit surprised that you've got a lot of this discussion about AI technology and whatnot, and what it's capable of, and yet there wasn't really any mentioning of like, I mean, maybe it's because he's just not, he has no, maybe even no awareness of all this kind of stuff. I don't know, but I would be very surprised if that wasn't the case. But I would have thought that has more of a poignant kind of or at least or relevant kind of thing when it comes to modernity. But I don't know. He just loves hookers, I guess. But you know, genuine hookers, one who actually put the work in. Some man born in the 50s pretending he was born in the 70s. A boomer. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's much else to really add. His his prose works better when you've got characters who actually have pain, I would say, and some sort of, like, when they're isolated and suffering, like Bruno in Atomized, the main character of Serotonin. I mean, I've read a few things saying like that novel picks up in the second half of it. I would disagree completely. I thought the comedy at the beginning of the first part was fucking brilliant, and probably still one of the funniest novels I'd read. And yeah, I thought it set up the whole premise of it gloriously. And when it became more poignant and depressing and isolated and individuated, it's making some great points about, you know, neoliberalism and how people are only really allowed to feel on an individual basis, and, you know, this atomization things. I think because he's moved away slightly from that, it's sort of lost, yeah, the outlook on it. But, you know, I suppose he can't always be harking on about the same shit, so I think that'll be it. I'll close it. Anyone want to spin the wheel? I have to prompt you. Or Patreon, you can become a member for $1 a month. Can't do any better than that. There's quite a few reviews on there. I will be mentioning what I'm up to, what's going on with the book, or I've already done that anyway. But yeah, updates and all that stuff. And yeah, I'm thinking this will be the kind of main thing for the streams. But there will be weeks where we'll probably need more time to actually get through the novels in question. And on those Saturdays, I quite like to do chill out streams, but I need to do it just privately so we can actually, you know, discuss shit without a filter. Because I hate this platform, as if it wasn't obvious enough already. And yeah, maybe somewhere down the pipeline we'll be doing like movie nights where we can watch films, obviously not on YouTube but elsewhere. So yeah, if you're interested in that. And I mentioned this, I guess, because I could talk about, has anyone seen The Substance yet? Because oddly enough, I mean, obviously I can't really compare Annihilation with this movie, but in some ways I would say that my expectation was let down in the same way, and the things that I liked about both of them I liked quite a lot, but also the things that were lacking, yeah, it was the same. But yeah, I would recommend it overall. It's basically a B movie, similar to some of the body horror stuff you saw in the late 80s, I would say, early 90s maybe. It's a B-wood film with a Hollywood production, and as a man, I think you'll appreciate it for the obvious reasons. But it's again too long, which I would say is similar to this novel. But I did think it was fun, and it just basically it's probably as shallow as the shallowness of the critique it's making in a lot of ways. But there are good parts to it, I thought, and yeah, takes some interesting turns, and I wasn't expecting some of the places it went, although I didn't really think it was saying anything new at the same time. I also watched the film Blink Twice. Fuck me, that film sucked. I'd avoid that at all costs. Dreadful movie. I don't know that seemed to be getting some praise as well, but it's actually objectively a bad film. I wouldn't bother with that. What else? I watched Stalker, which was fucking awesome. Don't really know how much I can go into a discussion about that, but yeah, that was. I was surprised in that one how much it did remind me of Solaris in terms of its themes and whatnot. I suppose I made an assumption by the title, thinking it was actually going to be about stalking, which it really wasn't. But I was actually very impressed with it, and I think to bring that up, I think that's what Annihilation's going for in some ways. It's got this slow burn, kind of almost like it wants to hypnotize you into it, which I think for Houellebecq is a slight risk because his prose isn't that hypnotic. To put it bluntly, I don't think he is good enough as a writer to pull that kind of thing off. And I don't think he's even trying to do that either. I think his thing's much more about analysing the current state of affairs in which we live, and that's all good. Like I'm fine with that. But if you're gonna make me read what in paperback is a 700+ page novel, it's got to have some biting satire or, eloquently written prose or something in it that's really going to just make it feel like I'm not reading a 700-page novel. Au contraire, I watched it on Stremio, but I feel like the ones that are there are not quite the theatrical releases, but they are good enough to watch. They're not like Cam. They're like the what do you call it? They have them. They're almost like the award releases or something, like that, in terms of like when they're nominated for stuff, they seem to suddenly come about. But yeah, that one is available, and I would say the thing that made it obvious that it wasn't quite the proper release was the sound, and maybe the color grading at times. But this thing it's all about the senses basically. Like it's attacking you on many fronts, but it has no depth, I wouldn't say. But at the same time, I kind of feel like that's the point. Like if it was actually supposedly demonstrating our times, I would be very in praise of it, because I did think it was satirizing what people place importance in. And the shallowness and superficiality of that is very much evident in the film itself, because even the characters are so shallow that you don't really know anything about them apart from what's on the surface. And in a lot of ways, it seems like that's all that fucking matters as well. So yeah, there were good things about it, but I was surprised. The amount of references and homages was a bit over the top, I would say. But then again, the ending itself was so ridiculously out there. I won't spoil it, but I loved it only on what it was saying politically or societally speaking, because it was literally like the shit you just see everywhere online all the time. So yeah, but on that regard, Painbow, you'll love it. Wink, wink. You won't be disappointed. But in the same regard, it's almost like you could have seen that shit by fucking Googling it if you wanted to, rather than watching a whole film. But maybe that was the point. I don't know. The next book. Platform. I've been wanting to reread this. It's short. What do you think? Oh no, I mean, I didn't mean. You see titties, if you really want to know. You see plenty. Trust me. I mean, I actually felt like it was too much, because, you know, once you've seen it, it's like, okay, let's move on. Nope, we're gonna carry on watching. Just keep watching. Just keep showing that ass. Like I felt like it was like, at what point does it become a little bit tedious? And like that, I mean, the story of it is so basic. That's my main complaint about it overall. I actually thought it was going to be quite in depth, but it's the opposite of that. But in the same way, I think that's what it was trying to go for. But yeah, come back to me once you've actually seen it, because it would be funny to discuss. Because I really don't want to spoil it for you. But yeah, stay patient with it, because the first hour, fuck all happens. Like, and it's only until, yeah, well, a certain point, then you're like, okay, this is interesting. But I won't say anything else, because I didn't really. All I knew was a few things that I'd heard about it, and I was kind of surprised by the places it went. No, it's not a collector's item. I wish it was. It's not the version. This isn't. I would say The Tenant. I'm. I mean, how many of you have read this? And it's kind of, I do have my own slight reason for wanting to read it, but also after reading that fucking Leviathan, I kind of want to just read something that's a bit more concise, if you know what I mean. What are you getting at? Yeah, I know who they're by. I have got a copy of Last Exit somewhere. So, put it to a vote. I'd say The Tenant personally, but I'm willing to discuss it for a little while. What are you getting at? What? I'm not making an effort. Promote. What do you want me to do? Fucking set up ads? Join the Patreon, you type fucking. That's where the good shit will be happening. So the tenant. Fine by me. I mean, I've just covered Houellebecq, who is, you know, according to the cover of this, is like the most important novelist alive, and no one cares, you know. So I'm not sure how much I care these days. I'm just thinking it's probably match of the day in about an hour. So no, well, none of you can pick because you're not patrons. Only patrons can pick, unless you pay for it. Then I'll do that. That's fine. 20 quid, and we'll read whatever you want. Green Face. No, I haven't. I haven't read this. But yeah, if anyone is interested, I'll probably forget to put this in the description, but I felt this was a pretty good article about Houellebecq. A stranger enters a magician's shop. Inside, among several strange customers, he sees an old man who makes him sick with horror. The rest of the novel chronicles his quest for the elusive and horrible old man. He sounds like an interesting guy. Ah, you've already read it, you slut. This year as well. Well, you mentioned The Tenant as well. Wow, isn't that nice? My friends. Probably looked this up before, but sounds relatable. Is it a bit Notes from Underground? See you simping for the book. Yeah, it does sound good. I need to fucking go on this up. I want to read. I think that'll remind me at some point. Well, I think I'll have to end the stream. Really, I mean, I've got nothing else to really add. In all honesty, The Tenant it is. I'm looking forward to reading it again. Remember the first time I read it, I found it fucking entertaining. So. If you want to spin the wheel, I mean, by all means. No, for The Tenant, I'd probably finish that in a week, I would guess. Yeah, it's short. I tried to watch the film with this, with Polanski in it, and I would say that the film sucks. Yeah, I'm going to call it a night. I'll see you next Saturday, I guess. Been fun. Kind of makes me wonder why. In general. Why? But that's fine. That's kind of where literature in general leads you to. You think you're going to find answers, and more often than not, you're just asking why. Whatever. Alright, yeah, I'll see you then. Have a good weekend. Take it easy. Thanks for reading it, those of you who did. until then, I guess.